Hello. This year marked the 100-year anniversary of the ending of World War I. And in spirit of that, I would like to discuss one of the nations in a little detail, Italy. Specifically, I would like to discuss their involvement in World War I through their weaponry, specifically the Carcano series of rifles. Before I continue, whenever handling a firearm, the first thing you should always do is check to ensure that it is unloaded. This weapon has no bullets in this house as far as I know, but it also lacks a firing pin, making this a fancy-looking club. Before we can actually get into the more interesting parts of this story, though, we should start a little further back, about 40 years before the beginning of World War I, because that's where Italy, modern Italy, actually begins in 1871. Italy had not been a unified country for about 1,500 years since the fall of Rome, in about 400 AD to the end of 500 AD. Italy, I should say, actually, instead had been a series of smaller interfighting states, though during the mid-1800s, a major nationalistic push had driven figures such as Giuseppe Garibaldi, the great Italian general, to push for the unification of Italy, mostly through a series of 3 wars with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and with the help of France very often. The Austro-Hungarian Empire detail is very important because they became closer allies after their reunification. In fact, signing many treaties that ensured, including their ally Germany, that should either any of these signatory nations become attacked by more than one enemy, the others would come to their aid. This would not be honored by Italy, because as anyone who knows anything about World War I remembers, Germany, like in World War II, was the major bad guy, even if World War I was not actually their fault, I would argue. Going back to Italy, they found a way outside of their treaties with the Austro-Hungarian Empire in order to then join the Allied powers, because as they saw it, they had a better chance of winning their lands if they defeat the one who owns their lands. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the nation that owns the northern parts of Italy that they still claim as part of the true Italian peninsula. To better understand this young nation's involvement in World War I think it would be very helpful to go over to the channel The Great War with Indy Neidell, who can better explain in more detail the state of the Italian people who weren't Italian.
Now, if we take a look at Italy in 1914, its population was around 35 million, making it the 6th largest European nation. But Italy was poor and mostly agricultural, and compared to the other large nations of Europe, was undeveloped. The per capita income, for example, was only half that of France's, and illiteracy was high. On top of this, Italy produced little steel, and was dependent on British coal, and was not even independent in terms of food supplies, relying on imported wheat to survive. Also, even though Italy may be unified as a nation, there was no real sense of nationhood among large parts of the population, or even ethnic unity. In terms of just language, a Venetian and a Sicilian could not understand each other. The Italian language was the dialect of Florence and was widely spoken only among the elite. The unification had also not brought forth the much-hoped-for social revolution, and power was concentrated among landowners and industrialists, which fostered resentment and political turmoil. Indeed, a quote from post-unification went like this: "Now we have made Italy, we still have to make the Italians."
So as we saw in that last video, Italy was at a very major disadvantage compared to its contemporary empires during the First World War. It relied on the imports from other nations to even feed its people, When it came to war supplies, such as horses, iron, the peninsula was almost completely devoid of these, requiring innovations, not all of them good, but innovations nonetheless, and that came in the Kakano series of rifles. This is the carbine, the cavalry rifle that I have here. In a moment we'll watch a video where we're introduced to the standard, longer rifle variant of the Kakano, but the military effectiveness of Italy can very well be described with the Carcanos. They are sparse weapons, very thin, and light when compared to analogous weapons from other countries. They also did their job not the best, though. Italy has been very well known for a long time as being one of the most militaristic nations in the world without being the best at war at all. In fact, in World War II, we see that the first nation they decided to invade is one that literally had to fight them off with bows and arrows. These weapons, however, come with innovations in their use because of their design. But before we can get into that, we should understand the design a little better. So for that, we will be moving on to the C&Rsenal for a better description of these weapons.
Today.
Well, I'm going to start off with the primary arm of Italy, and that is going to be, oh good lord, what many people will call a Mannlicher, but it is just the Carcano 1891 rifle. Now, this is a hefty boy, but not as heavy as you'd think. It's narrow. It's, like I said, light for its size. It's very simple construction. Looking up close, we are a bolt-action rifle. We use a 6-round end-block clip, just like with the Berthier before. This is going to go in and stay in until we chamber that last round, at which point it will fall out this hole in the bottom. Just like with those Berthiers and the Gewehr 88s we talked about, this is going to be a problem for mud entering the action. It's going to make this gun very dirty in the trench, and it's going to keep kind of giving it some problems with cleaning. Although, I haven't heard as many complaints about these guys fouling up with mud as some other designs because they have some pretty loose tolerances to them. Now, the Carcano is descended from that German Gewehr 88. I mean, you can tell at a glance, it looks a lot like it.
As mentioned previously, Italy had a very poor supply of horses for their cavalry, which made the 1893 model of the Carcano, the cavalry Carcano that we just saw that I showed you a moment ago, interesting in that there were few cavalrymen to actually supply it with. There are a few reasons why they're different, and I wanted to take the chance to tell you about it. When you're on a horse, you're required to carry a cavalry saber as a cavalryman. It would be very difficult to have not only a sword, but also a large bayonet strapped to your hip, slapping and banging your leg as you try and ride. That is where the carbine's innovation of a fixed bayonet comes in. Very quickly, you're able to immediately have a very pointy needle at the end of your weapon without lugging around a whole nother knife on your horse. Again, though, there weren't a whole lot of actual cavalrymen, so really who these were given to were the mobile infantry. These weren't mechanized infantry. In fact, these were often bikemen. Otherwise, these would be companies who were given less supplies to carry this much smaller, much lighter rifle and told to run to the front line. This might seem comical at first, but it actually made kind of a lot of sense for World War I. Mobile infantry was almost non-existent, especially on the Western Front, very famous for the trench warfare that dominated all of France, leading from Switzerland to the English Channel. Why this was so important was because Italy actually innovated. Italy innovated in the war because of their disadvantages. They were forced to produce lighter weaponry because they did not have the actual means to produce larger, better quality weaponry like their enemies and allies. However, this also forced them to use tactics that favored these weapons when they could. Mountain warfare was very in favor of the Italians because of their light rifles that did not often compromise for power. In fact, while these weapons were never the #1 grade A standard, they fired almost every time. And in fact, despite very open designs as described in the previous video, it didn't get as dirty as many others, which was a major advantage towards the bogged down winters of Europe. These problems would continue in Italy for a long time, into their fascism. And they were famous for their bloodthirsty eagerness for war, their militarism as an entire nation, even for not being very good at it. They were still, and are, the symbolic beginning of Western civilization, and for the foreseeable future, likely will not fall far from the world stage, having a culture that, while stagnant in modern times, its ancient roots are still seen in the entire Western Hemisphere. And that's why, even if they didn't have a major impact, they're still important, and they should be remembered. Thank you for your time.